Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Sfera. I'm with TransTec. Welcome to today's webinar on EPS Repairs 101. Today's webinar is going to be presented by Darren Whitefield, Elena Rodrigo Lopez, and Mackenzie Timms from TransTec. Each of them has a different function at TransTec, either from engineering or from the technical side. And each of them, all of them will be available for the Q&A session that we will have after the presentation. Before we get going, I just wanted to get through a couple of ground rules and kind of familiarize you with the GoToWebinar control panel as we go forward. So we will have a Q&A session, as I mentioned, after the presentation. The presentation will be about 8 minutes long, approximately. But we don't want you to have to wait to ask your questions. So what you'll see on your GoToWebinar control panel, there is a tab that has the word questions on it. So if you have any questions that come up as we go through the presentation that you want to mark down, please feel free to send those questions along. And then after the presentation, we will go through and answer those questions accordingly. If you just want to wait until after the presentation and ask your questions at that time, that's no problem as well. Also, before we get going, just want to make sure that everything's working from a technical perspective. So if you can hear me, hit there should be a button on your GoToWebinar control panel where you can raise your hand. It's like a little hand icon. If you can hit that, if you can hear me okay, I just want to make sure enough of you can hear me okay. See a bunch of hands going up. Cool. So it looks like everything's working well from a technical perspective. You can put your hands back down at this point, and we're going to get started. Before we get going, Darren, as the presenter of our lead presenter, is there anything you'd like to say to the group before we get going and start the presentation?
No, I'd just like to echo what you said and thank everybody for coming and hope this is informational for all, as well as like Danny said, we're free to open any questions at the end. So make sure you're commenting and writing them down at least so we can answer them at the end.
Cool. One other thing to mention is we will be notifying those who won the prizes. We will be notifying you via email after the presentation, after the webinar. And also, we are recording the webinar, so both the webinar and the slides from the webinar will be available to you on demand. And again, you will receive an email with that information of where you can access the video of the webinar if you need to reference it in the future. And also if you need to download the presentation slides. The last thing is, at the end of the webinar, we will provide a link where you will have access to our team for a one-on-one consultation. If you haven't gotten started with EPS in your shop, we will help you with our consultation. We will help you get going with it and answer any questions that you might have on a one-on-one basis. And if you are already doing EPS, we can also help you determine how to improve your EPS operation. So without further ado, I'm going to get going with the presentation. And like I said, if you have any questions, please hit the questions button in the GoToWebinar tab, and we'll answer those afterwards. All right, here we go.
Today, we plan to discuss the following topics. What is EPS? Some trends the market is currently seeing in regards to EPS, hydraulic steering versus EPS, and the types of EPS currently in production. Starting off, what is EPS? EPS stands for electronic power steering. It replaces the hydraulic portion of the rack with an electronic circuit board and motor. It began being put into production in the early 2000s. It originally started in Europe due to the smaller size of the cars and hit the US a few years later. Next, we're going into market trends. We've seen a dramatic shift to EPS over the course of the last 6 years. Only 6% of new vehicles are hydraulic, so EPS is where we're seeing a majority of the manufacturers moving to. As you can see from the graph here, you really want to look at the green bars that shows the increase of EPS over the last 6 years and the decline of HPS in the last 6 years. We saw 71% of EPS racks in 2014, which grew to 79% in 2016, and are seeing roughly 92% of vehicles have EPS in 2020. Next, we're going to focus on the difference between the two steering systems. Historically, a steering unit was configured of a hydraulic rack and pinion and hydraulic pump. The engine would power the hydraulic pump using a belt. The pump would then send pressurized fluid into the hydraulic rack and pinion to provide steering assistance. With the evolution of EPS, the need for belts, hydraulic pumps, power steering fluid, and hoses was eliminated. In an electronic steering system, an electronic control module, otherwise known as an ECU, communicates between the steering wheel and the rack. A key benefit with EPS allows for better fuel economy due to the lighter weight of the system. Next, we'll dive into the various types of EPS, which consists of an electronic column drive system, electro-hydraulic pump, and electronic rack and pinion. The electronic column drive system is made of 3 main components: an ECU, a motor, and a torque sensor. In an electronic column drive system, the only electronics are in the column, which then connects to a manual system to provide assistance. A column failure is the torque sensor, which is normally an easy replacement. Some of the other key components that you are going to see in the manual portion of the rack are the pinion seal, rack bar bushing, and bearings, which really is no different than a hydraulic rack repair. These are all common components that are accessible in TransTec kits. Next, the electro-hydraulic pump is set up similar to previous hydraulic steering racks. However, the electronic control module is located on a hydraulic pump, which then controls in a hydraulic rack. The electro-hydraulic pump works similar to a hydraulic steering system where the pump sends pressurized fluid to a hydraulic rack and pinion, but unlike a fully hydraulic system, the fluid is pressurized by a motor and an electronic module rather than a belt from the engine. Some common failures you will see include the motor and electronic module. On the hydraulic side, some common failures include bad sealing components and bearings. We wanted to call out this portion because it's a notable repair that we are seeing. The last style that we are discussing is the electronic rack and pinion. There are 3 different types of EPS racks, including pinion drive, dual pinion, and direct drive.
All right, thanks for sticking with me. I've pulled out 4 different racks. We're going to touch on the components that we just touched on previously. We'll go through each of them. So starting out here, these are dual pinion racks. So both are going to have the same components we touched on, torque sensors. Both of these actually have modules bolted right to the rack themselves, which includes the motor and the electronics. What's going to make these different, though, is this rack here is actually belt driven. So we touched on that previously. Motor is going to drive the rack bar with a belt. This rack, however, is actually driven by a worm gear. So instead of it being a belt, motor is going to drive the rack bar with a worm gear. Next, we have a pinion drive. So this is going to have the same components that we touched on. Torque sensor can be found on the pinion. It's going to have a motor as well as a module. However, the module itself is going to be external to the rack. So it's going to be found somewhere else in the vehicle. Pinion driven instead of either by belt or by worm gear. So that's what's going to be different from the others. Finally, this is going to be a direct driven rack. So instead of having it by a pinion drive or by a belt or by a worm gear, this is actually going to have the motor around the rack bar itself. So you're still going to have the torque sensor on the pinion. It's going to drive the electronic portion and drive the motor, but the motor is actually going to be right around the rack bar. And that's what's going to give you assistance.
In relation to each of these, high-level failures that we commonly see are caused by bad motors, damage to the electronic board and circuitry, or a bad torque sensor. The remainder of the rack is very similar to a hydraulic rack and is made up of mechanical features. Common failures you will see include worn rack bar bushings, worn or damaged bearings, electrical connection points, and sealing components that will need replacement. Now that we've touched on the basics of the EPS systems, it's time to talk about different EPS strategies to provide within the industry. Overall, we will see three main strategies that we help customers work towards. It's important to note that with each of these strategies, you'll need a capability to test the racks, requiring some diagnostic equipment. Strategy 1, test, clean it, sell it. First step would be to test the rack and make sure there is full functionality. One would then clean it, which includes either a standard clean procedure or painting the rack, then providing it to your customer. A second strategy requires a little more work. You would again test the rack and make sure there is functionality. If there is an issue, one could then replace any seals, mechanical components, or the electronic portion to bring the rack back to full functionality. At this point, it's ready to sell. The final strategy would include testing it, making electronic repairs, and selling it. For this final strategy, it then again starts with testing the rack for full functionality. If there are any issues, one could look to make electronic repairs alongside replacement of common wear items. Electronic repairs could include replacements of capacitors or EPROMs. At this point, the rack would have full functionality and you'd be able to provide it to your customer. This completes the information we have for this webinar. I appreciate you taking your time to go through the information with us. We'd now like to take the next several moments to go over any questions that you may have.
Okay, so that completes the presentation that we wanted to review. At this point, we're going to make ourselves open for questions. There were some questions that have come through the panel while that was happening. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask of anyone on the team, you can either send it through the questions tab on the GoToWebinar panel, or if you prefer, you can raise your hand. I will unmute you, and then you can ask your question directly to the team, and we'll take as many questions as we can here in our time allotted. We want to make sure that we are cognizant of your time as well, so we don't. We're not going to. It's not going to go on for too long, but we do want to make sure that we address any questions that are out there. So again, feel free to send it through the questions tab on the GoToWebinar panel, or raise your hand by clicking the hand button on your GoToWebinar panel, and we can go from there. All right. So let me get Darren, Elena, and Mackenzie. Let me get into some of the questions that have come through. Here. Okay. Okay, so the first question, if I have a failed EPS rack, how can I go about fixing it? So I'm not sure, Darren or Elena or Mackenzie, which one of you wants to address that?
Sure, I can just run through. So as of today, TransTec, we have a small list of applications or electronic modules that we actually carry. This will allow you to actually swap out any electronic failure. So this would be good for those strategies where you're not really looking to do electronic repairs yourself, but are more interested in fixing the rest of the manual portion of the rack or the mechanical portion. We provide, like I said, a handful of electronic modules that are bolt-on solutions. So you can remove the electronics that you see are not working correctly. You can swap it out with one of our remanufactured modules, bolt it on, and then we just receive a core back for that. So it's a pretty straightforward process that allows you guys to have complete racks, electronic racks available for your customers without actually going in and diagnosing the electronic failures yourself. And that's in addition to any other kits or other components too that you might have needs for electronic racks.
Cool. So the next question has come through from Jose. And the question, Darren, is what's the TransTec product portfolio for EPS repair?
So like I said, we have not a huge listing right now, but it's something we're definitely working through expanding. Right now we have applications available for Ford Fusion, Ford Focus, the Mini Cooper we showed in the presentation, Mazda's. This list we can actually provide to you if you want to reach out afterwards, but right now we're also in development for Explorer, F-150, and then looking at as well as GM applications. And that's just for basically electronic fixes. We have a long list of EPS kits that are more for seals and components that is more true to our business today.
Cool. Jose, does that answer your question? I tried to unmute you, but I don't think you're hooked up to a speaking device. So, okay, Jose says yes. So the next question that came through from Morris, does steering angle sensor on F-150 mean that the unit is no good, but all readings say it works well? Morris, let me see if you are, Morris, if you want to add on to that, you are unmuted now if you wanted to follow up on that note.
Yes, I'm here.
Go ahead, please ask your question. I'm not sure if I asked it correctly from the note.
Do you hear me?
We do hear you, yes.
Okay. Yeah, what I'm getting a lot of is on the F-150s, on my scanner of Snap-on, I'm always getting an angle sensor faulty, but all the rest of the readings come out well. So I'm thinking, is it something that you can still let it go out without having a problem? Or it just really means you need to fix the steering angle sensor? Because I'm still getting good readings on everything else, like, all the rest of the readings type of thing, It's just that it's just telling me steering angle sensor on the codes.
Danny, I think this is a question for Elena, if you want to unmute her, sorry.
Okay. Elena, go ahead, Elena.
Hi, good afternoon. If you have an error code in the steering, sorry, I would not sell the rack. I mean, first of all, I would double check for sure that the parameters that you have are correct. And I'll review that the values from the Newton, so the torque and the position values are changing as same as the voltage and the amperes. I would be a bit, I would double check that information. You can send that if you have the error code, you can send it to us, to my email or to Darren, and we can double check with you with more details. But I would don't sell that rack if you have that info, because the customers will see that error code in the instrument cluster in the panel of the car.
Okay, thank you.
Morris, we'll send you a note. To give you contact information for Elena and for Darren if you want to, so that you can send that error code.
No problem.
Okay?
Yeah, perfect, man.
All right. Let's see here. The next one is from Craig. After decades of working on hydraulic and manual steering, even with the testing machine, will TransTec be able to offer training in repairing the electrical aspects of these racks? Even the disassembly of these newer racks are completely new for us, and one wrong step will damage them further. Let me see if Craig is still on here. He is. Craig, you are unmuted if you wanted to add to that note.
Yeah, I'm down there in Kingston, Jamaica. Good to hear from you guys again. We do repairs of power steering, and we also remove the components from the cars and put them back in. So we are at a point now where we're seeing more demand for these things, primarily like European cars. And they're completely Spanish to us. They're incredibly complex, and we're trying to figure out how to get into this. But it's like we got to learn this thing all over.
It's a great question. Today, I don't think we have anything formalized for trainings specifically around disassembly, but it's definitely something we can look forward to. So we want to help grow this with you guys just as we want it to grow for ourselves. So if it's potential YouTube videos or maybe additional webinars like this, that we start looking at particular applications and give a breakdown or a process of how we see that it would be best to be torn down, it's definitely something we can look at in the future.
All right, cool, thanks.
I appreciate the question, and like I said, it's a great thought.
All right, thank you.
All right. Next one. Make sure there's none coming through here. Okay. Make sure there's no raised hands. All right. So the next one that came through here, guys, is when I'm rebuilding hydraulic racks, replacing quite a few sealing components that you provide. Are there as many components that need to be replaced in an electronic rack?
So there aren't as many sealing critical components as you see in hydraulic racks, but you are going to see different components that need to be replaced as well. So if you look at the Fusion, Focus, or F-150 applications, anything that's kind of belt driven or has a belt, that's going to be an item that may need to be replaced when you're doing these remanufacturing processes. So there's still going to be additional components you'll need when doing these rebuilds, but it's going to look different than rebuilding hydraulic.
That came from John. Let me see if John is still with us. No, he's not with us. So hopefully that answered the question. The next one's coming from Steve. This was mentioned during the presentation, but I think I missed it. What percentage of new vehicles have EPS rack? I think that was at the beginning of the presentation, right, Darren?
Yeah, so right now we're estimating at about 92% of new vehicles are coming out with some sort of version of electronic power steering, and we highlighted the differences in that. But that's information that we've purchased and data we've collected through the years. So that's what we're seeing at this rate. We're definitely seeing the change, and I think you guys are as well, from moving from hydraulic racks into EPS.
Cool. Steve, does that answer your question, Steve? I think he's not connected to a microphone, so we'll keep going here. The next one, is it really an improvement? I'm trying to read this correctly. Is it really an improvement, electronic versus hydraulic? Looks like the second has more issues. I guess looks like electronic has more issues, maybe? I think I'm reading that right, Darren.
Yeah, so from the outside, EPS definitely can look scary. It looks like it has more issues and things like that just because it's new to everyone. But looking at some of the things we highlighted, and even in future webinars, we'll dive into it some more, but EPS is really more efficient, it's more reliable, and mechanically it's simpler than hydraulic racks. So it's eliminating any need for power steering pumps, hoses, fluids altogether. So it is, like I said, scary and new for all of us, but it should be better moving forward and should still allow steering rebuilders to have a need or be needed in the industry. So it's definitely a good thing that we can all work together and improve on.
Cool. All right, there's two more that have come through. First is, are the behavior of the electronic rack very different between each other? I guess maybe between different racks, maybe, Darren?
Yeah, Elena, I don't know if you want to take this one, or Mackenzie.
Sure, no problem. Each rack is developed by a different manufacturer, could be next year, Fumoco, Bosch. So they can be physically different, but when you study the parameters and then behavior, it's similar. No, but you have to check is the voltage that you have by the battery, the amperes, the torque sensor, and the position sensor, or the motor values. So this information I'm going to explain in future webinars. So I think the person that asked that will have all the doubts solved in future webinars.
Cool. So, Linda, this just to reiterate, this is something that we're going to be covering in future webinars, right? Probably
Yeah.
January.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. We are thinking on doing like a one webinar for each type of like Ford, and we focus on Ford, and we explain the different racks we have, or we focus on GM and we explain the different types of rack we have, so we can maybe talk about the main parameters or the main error codes and how to fix them, and how to repair each type of rack.
Perfect. So yeah, look for those upcoming webinars. Our plan is to continue to do those, as Elena said, for each manufacturer, so that we can get really detailed into each one of them, and present a more comprehensive look at each one of them. So the last, let me see here. There's another one that popped in. It's another one from Morris. The question is well, there's two questions actually. First one is, how long do you think hydraulic will be around in our industry? And the second is, how advanced is the TransTec team in developing new plugs?
So hydraulic we see is not going away really anytime soon. We're still being asked to develop some hydraulic kits for applications that aren't covered today. We have not seen any sales slow down from a kits perspective on hydraulic, which is showing us that there's still definitely a drive and a need for hydraulic racks. We're closely monitoring the changeover from hydraulic to electronic, just because it's a core business of ours as well, right? So we'll continue monitoring it, but up to this point, we have not seen a drastic shift from mechanical to EPS, even though, like I said earlier, that new vehicles have about 92% of EPS racks in them. So we'll continue to monitor it and release that information as we get it. In regards to creating new tests and new harnesses, it's something we're definitely developing. We're working alongside with a supplier who's working or provides the V-Carsis with us to develop those tests and making sure that we have some new applications loaded into there. We've had some difficulties with that because of this pandemic that's occurred to everybody. So there's been some slowdown there, but still on our list of things to do. And we want to make sure that our test stand is encompassing popular vehicles. So I hope that answered both of those.
See, Morris, you got anything? Is that good for you?
Yeah, that's good news.
All right. All right. Next one here came from Jake, and looks like Jake is gone, but is the electronic portion the main cause of failure in EPS units?
Not always. Sorry, Darren, I'm taking that one.
No problem. Yep, go ahead.
Not always, because it depends on the manufacturer or the type of EPS that you have. You know, it's a pump, a column, or a rack. The unit will have some strengths or weaknesses. So it could be the sensor, or it could be the model, or maybe some mechanic elements that could be, for example, the belt. You know? So when you see the DTC, the error code in the scan tool, that can give you an idea of where the problem could be, but you need to have more information, like